So this session is being recorded and they'll be put on YouTube, but you have the choice to turn your video off. So just, I'm notifying about that. So thank you for joining the session, 6-Day War, 53 Years Later. Whoever doesn't know, or the first time, I'm the Shlicha for B'nai Israel, Netta Asner-Minster. I also, I decided to do this also because today marks actually 53 years since the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War took place between June 5th and June 10th. So today marks the day that the Golan, towards the end of the war, when the Golan was conquered or taken, or however you want to call it. And we'll talk about what happened afterwards as well. And also this was the day that the UN began discussions of ceasefire. So we're really marking this day 53 years later. So before I begin, I just want to note that this is going to be more of a lecture type thing. I will have one video and pictures of maps, and I'll be focusing on talking about explaining what happened during the 6-Day War, and then focusing from that on a few things that happened following the war up until today. And those subjects have to do with land, and what happened with the various pieces of land afterwards, which will then bring us to the discussion of the road to peace, specifically with the Palestinians, which is very relevant today, given the Trump peace plan that is being currently, the first step is going to be officially taken on July 1st with the decision that Netanyahu has announced, the Prime Minister of Israel, that they're going to be annexing, now I'm blinking again, the Jordan Valley and the northern part of the Dead Sea. So we will talk about that as well, and talk about, in addition to that, another side that I was exposed to more in depth recently, which is Palestinian refugees as well. They will all tie in together, but because as this subject is really controversial and loaded and etc., I do want to say, first of all, that I will not advocating my opinion, but of course I'm not neutral. I'm Israeli and I live where I live, and I'm passionate about this subject. So I am going to present both sides, and of course not, again, advocate my personal position and try to maintain neutrality. I also am happy to hear your comments, your questions, and feel free to use the chat that we have here below, so we can continue a discussion, and of course we'll have questions at the end as well. So that's pretty much our framework for today, and we'll begin with discussing what actually led up to the 6-Day War, and then talking about the results that happened afterwards. So before I actually begin the session, I also do my little pitch for the B'nai that I'm a part of, and also another project that I'm a part of as well, which I am now putting in the chat. So the first link is the Join Virtually B'nai. So any programs that B'nai is doing will be there. And in addition, Life Online is a project that I am a part of with community shlichim in the DMV area and beyond. And we create a lot of different content, from philosophy to different inventions in Israel, leading ladies, and history as well. So I would really invite you to either sign up for a weekly email, which I am in charge of, or to check out our Facebook group as well. Okay, so now we will begin with a short briefing of the 6-Day War. But I'll just note that I based a lot of this, as you can see, from this wonderful book, and I really recommend you to read it. It's by Michael Oren, 6 Days of War, a true classic, and a lot of research done to create this book. It is relatively a little bit older. I think it came out 2000 or 2001, or early 2000s in any case, but I highly recommend it. Okay, so the 1967 was the 6-Day War, but it's important to be aware that Israel was founded in 1948, and in 1956 was another war in which Israel conquered Sinai And the result was that Israel gave back Sinai at the end of that war. And more importantly, that in addition, the UN put forces in there called UNEF that was on the border between Israel and Egypt. At the same time, Egypt was involved with sending troops to Yemen, so they had low resources at the time, but they had an agreement between them and Syria, and created this United Arab Command, in which they both wanted to create a united front against Israel. So they knew that they wanted to continue the war that took place in 1948 and also 1956, and basically, to be completely honest, wipe Israel off the map. So in 1967 came about, and Syria started sending rockets towards Israel. And Egypt was mad because they had forces in Yemen. They were trying to build their resources and weren't prepared for a war, and yet Syria was putting them in a place and they were prepared for a war. So what actually brought the Six-Day War to be in 1967, and specifically in June? Well, that was the involvement of the Soviets, and that's also where we have the Soviets and Americans involved as well in this war. The Soviets actually told Egypt that between May 16th to the 22nd, Israel was going to attack in Syria. And they had aerial pictures that show that forces were moving towards the north, which that was incorrect. That was not true. But that announcement, it's unclear why the Soviets said that or what the purpose was or where it came from, but that's what basically spiraled the whole thing. It made Syria and Egypt to be more forceful in their language and more violent as well in their preparedness and that they were preparing for war also verbally. But in actual fact, towards the end of May, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, which is basically showing aggression. They were preventing Israel to have access to the port of Eilat, that's the most southern border of Israel. They removed the UN forces from the border of Egypt between Israel and Egypt, and also they actually were moving forces towards the border. So in that case, they were really showing that they were expressing aggression. They were not allowing different boats to come into the port of Eilat. They removed, UN peace forces, and they were bringing their forces towards the border. At the same time, however, Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, was really looking for a diplomatic route and spoke to the Americans and other countries, and they had suggested sending a boat regatta through the Straits of Tiran and seeing if Egypt shot first, because they basically wanted Egypt to shoot first and Israel wouldn't start the aggression. That was what they wanted to prevent. However, the Americans were also in Vietnam at the time, so they really had their head somewhere else. And what ended up happening is that the regatta plan was not taken seriously, and time was of the essence pretty much. There were threats on Israel's border, rockets from the north, forces moving from the south, and they knew that they had to take action. So that in the end of the day, even though Levi Eshkol was really trying to take a diplomatic route and do everything he could, Moshe Dayan and Rabin and a lot of other people in the government really felt that Israel was under threat. They had to take action. So on the 5th of June in the morning, the Israeli Air Force took the first lead, which actually determined the whole war. They sent out planes early in the morning to go to Egypt, and they basically wiped out 75% of the Egyptian Air Force. And that's really what kind of changed the whole war and kind of determined how it was going to be. But it's important to be aware that for Israel, the main focus of the 1967 war was Egypt. Egypt was their main enemy. It was the strongest country in the Middle East that kind of determined verbally what would be the situation, how would they address Israel. And the whole picture that I have in the poster, which I'll now share so you can see it, this picture over here of the Kotel, of the Western Wall, which has become so prominent regarding the Six-Day War, was not the main goal. It was a goal that was achieved afterwards, but we mark Jerusalem Day as, the anniversary of the Six-Day War, even though the achievement against Syria and Egypt were the main goals because they were the main enemies of Israel at the time. So that's how basically the 6-Day War started. It started with that strike that was defined as a preemptive strike, but because Israel actually saw all these acts of aggression take place in advance, and the UN later used it as a exception to use of force. And I see, Jonathan, you're answering questions, so I will refer to it at the end, but thank you for already asking questions. I appreciate it. So it's actually used as an exception to use of force in the UN, the preemptive strike, because they had those proof of aggression taken in advance. So that is pretty much how the war started, and I will show you now the results of the war, meaning what was the situation when the war ended. So this is the map from, here, 1 second. This is the map from 6 Days of War. I hope you can see it here. So here, I'll move. So the squiggly lines are what he defined as captured territories, meaning this is additional land that Israel gained following the war. So we have the Golan Heights, we have East Jerusalem and the West Bank as well, or Judea and Samaria, or the territories. I will use all three so that we're all good. We have Gaza, and we have all of Sinai as well. So all of Sinai up until, I'm trying to even go closer, up until the southern border of Sharm el-Sheikh. This was the Straits of Tiran that were blocked by Egypt, and Israel really gained an enormous amount of land after the 6-Day War. So understanding what was gained during the war really helps to understand also the all that's happened afterwards as well, and the relations and reactions with different countries. And that's basically what I want to talk about today, is understanding the 6-Day War, and through that understanding what is happening today with the Trump plan, with the annexation. And I'm happy to discuss more, and feel free to, again, disagree and discuss. That's the point, but that's what the conversation will be today, basically. So I do want to discuss the different parts of the land in order to talk about the results of the 6-Day War. I'm going to focus, first of all the different lands, and then regarding the road to peace, as I mentioned beforehand, I'll be focusing on specifically this territory, so the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or the territories, when discussing the development of this road to peace and how it has brought us to where the situation is today. Okay, so we're going to focus first on on Sinai. Okay, so before I go back to this, I just want to. Okay. Oh, did I close it by mistake? Okay, sorry. So before I actually go into, I'll go back to the map again. I do have another quote that I wanted to. I have two quotes that I wanted to share beforehand. So. Regarding, besides the piece of land there was, I also just want to share other things that were the results of the war. And this is from Michael Oren's book. It's excerpts from page 305 to 307 if people are interested. So 132 hours. That was the duration of the war, one of the shortest in recorded history. In that brief period, the Egyptians lost between 10,000 to 15,000 men. IDF fatality figures were placed at 800. In per capita terms of 80,000 Americans. 85% of Egypt's hardware, $2 billion worth, was destroyed. Israel had conquered 42,000 square miles and was now 3.5 times its original size. The Jewish state now threatened Damascus, Cairo, and Amman. Its own capital was united. Israel had earned the solid respect of the United States. And all this in 6 days. So it really was an incredible war regarding Israel's achievements, but again, I'm focusing on specific aspects of the results or of the war. So regarding the Sinai, following the war itself, the Arabs expressed these three no's, and it's important to understand that Egypt was the one that was leading this discussion because they were really Israel's main enemy in that case. So to quote from the book as well, their three no's was no peace with Israel, no survival of the influence of imperialism, and no existence in our land in the Zionist state. The Arab masses will never let any responsible Arab person remain alive who would dare negotiate with Israel. So this is right after the 6-Day War. That this was where Egypt was standing at that time. However, it's important to be aware that in 1973, the Yom Kippur War happened. And this is where also Egypt was a main role. And Israel was not prepared for the war, despite the fact that they didn't have any major losses. They had major losses in people. They didn't have many major losses regarding land. It really was a loss for the amount of people. And there's a lot of songs in Israel. And it's a really cultural, difficult time for a lot of Israelis. And Golda Meir even stepped down from her position as prime minister because of the fact that they were so unprepared for the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So this war kind of changed the situation that was happening with Egypt. And I'll just share once again the map. So in 1975, what the situation was is that Egypt and Israel signed an agreement that they would have mutual agreement. They had mutual intentions for a peace agreement. And that peace agreement also involved giving back the Sinai in exchange for peace. So 1975 was when they first showed intentions for that. In 1977 was Sadat's visit to Israel, which I'm going to share a little bit of clip of that as well, really short. But I want to show you how big and major it was, basically, to people who were living in Israel that this was happening. So I'm sharing two parts. One is the beginning, and then I will skip a little afterwards. Okay, I'm skipping 1 moment here. I just want to show another here. So this is him visiting the Israeli parliament.
بسم الله. السيد رئيس الكنيست، كملوا أي التواء يعقوب والأسباط وما أوتي موسى وعيسى والنبيون من ربهم لا نفرق بين أحد منهم ونحن له مسلمون. صدق الله العظيم والسلام عليكم.
So it's just a short clip to give you the feel of the time. But basically, it was a really major event because I purposely showed the quote beforehand. That was no peace with Israel, no recognition whatsoever of the Zionist state, and we will kill anyone who does so. And Egypt was the main enemy. So the fact that they actually he was visiting Israel and addressing the Israeli parliament was a really big deal in 1977. And in 1982, the peace agreement was officially finalized. And Sinai was given back to Egypt. I will note, however, that Sadat did pay with his life. And in the 6th of October, 1981, he was assassinated. So yes, the peace happened with Egypt, but if you ask people if they can go to Egypt freely, the answer is no. However, I do have friends who visit Sinai, and it's become a kind of hippie type place that people hang out, for sure. But it's not a warm peace that Egyptians can come to Israel and Israelis can go to Egypt. So that is with Sinai and the development of the relations with Egypt. I'll go back to the map once again. There we go. And now I'm going to refer to the Golan. Oops, sorry, that's jumping forward. I'm going to refer to the Golan Heights. So this is this piece of land over here. So Israel in the beginning had military jurisdiction in this area, and only in 1981 they annexed this area, which up until recently was not recognized by anyone, but recently Trump said he recognizes the Golan Heights as part of Israel. I will note, though, that also a lot of Druze lived in this area, that they didn't recognize Israel, that they were angry, they weren't part of Syria, they wouldn't accept an Israeli ID, and there was a lot of tension with people who lived in this area that used to be Syrian citizens and were now part of Israel. However, today, the situation is also that Trump recognized the Golan Heights, which means something to Israel, that the U.S. recognized that. And also because of the civil war that's been taking place in Syria since the early 2010s, we have actually seen a rise in the amount of Druze from this area who are seeking an Israeli ID, an Israeli passport, because they see that there really isn't much left for them in Syria and there isn't what to look forward to. So it's interesting to see that the developments that have been happening in the region have actually caused the Golan Heights to be less of a focus. I'm sure they are to some people, and people, it's still disputed by a lot of countries in the world, but it's not as much as in the focus as it used to be due to the situation in Syria and due to the recent recognition as well. So that is the Golan Heights and the situation. I also want to focus on Gaza, and that will connect us to this road to peace regarding the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So Gaza was under Israeli jurisdiction, and they actually created 25 settlements in the border of Gaza called Gush Katif. And these settlements mostly dealt with agriculture. They had Palestinians who they hired for their various agricultural farms. And in addition, however, there was IDF personnel who were there for security reasons, and due to the fact that it was close to the Sinai border, and still for protection from people in Gaza. And then later on, that developed to the 2005 decision for disengagement from Gaza and the removal of those settlements of Gush Katif from Gaza as well. And the idea was to provide it with independence and be autonomous. However, the elections that happened after 2005, the Palestinians voted for Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. And following, we've had 3 operations or wars. They're defined as operations in 2008, 2012, and 2014. So it's important to be aware of that fact, because when you see the results are happening in Gaza, I think that a lot of Israelis have in the back of their minds, it happened not so recently, and what could happen with independence from independence in other locations as well. At the same time, Gaza and the West Bank are separate, and therefore and relatively far apart. So the various plans have an idea of bringing them together in a way that they could be autonomous together. The other thing that I want to point out specifically is also Jerusalem. So the thing that happened immediately after the war is that East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem became united, because East Jerusalem was under Jordanian jurisdiction. So that became united immediately after the 6-day war. However, the Arabs who live in East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. They have a unique status. Until the 1980s, I did research on it, and please, if somebody knows, please correct me if I'm wrong, but until the 1980s, they had Jordanian passports. But now at the moment, there's a good bunch of people who live in East Jerusalem that are not citizens of any country. And they are residents of Israel, meaning they receive healthcare and they receive, basic needs from the state, and they're able to vote in municipality elections, but they cannot vote in general elections because they're not citizens. So it created a complicated situation with the Arabs that live in East Jerusalem, which is about 250,000 people at the moment. Another complication that's happened at the moment is that the Temple Mount was given to the Waqf, which is under the Jordanian jurisdiction, which means that as a Jew or Jews generally cannot go up and pray at the Temple Mount. They're also limited to when they can go on the Temple Mount as well. So that's been a lot of criticism towards Moshe Dayan, who did that pretty much immediately after the war. And today there are various movements that are talking about returning to the Temple Mount. There have been also various times where people going on the Temple Mount has caused tension between the Palestinians and Israelis. So really those two things, the East Jerusalem Arabs and the Temple Mount, are two issues in Jerusalem that are not solved and are still continuing today regarding also the conflict. I mean, this is also part of what will the Palestinian state look like. You know, if there is one, what is being annexed, what is not being annexed. This whole discussion is also have to do with the fact that we have these two complications as well in Jerusalem, in the capital of Israel. So this started from 1967, and that's where the development of it as well. So that's Gaza and Jerusalem. And now we're going to move on from that to relate to specifically the West Bank, the area here. Or Judea and Samaria. I don't know what political opinions are, so again, I'll cover everything. So the issue was that after the war, there were 950,000 Palestinians that lived in this area that Israel did not expect that they would have to have under their wing. And they honestly didn't want to add so many Palestinians to become citizens of Israel. They wanted to keep the Jewish majority, and that was the ideal at the time. So they kept the situation of having it under military jurisdiction. And I am almost certain that if the leaders then knew the complex situation that would happen 50 years later, they would have found a solution at the time. However, the military jurisdiction left it in this middle kind of situation that and also various peace agreements over time left it in this middle situation that we have today. So right after the war, you had military jurisdiction. You still have at the moment in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. And after this territory become under Israel's jurisdiction, though, even though it was military, you had the beginning of Jewish settlements being built in this area as well. So it started as early as 1969, the Gush Etzion block, which is right near Jerusalem, it's about here more or less, was built from 1969. And the majority of the building in these areas of the Jewish settlements happened in the late 70s and early 80s. And the reason is that Begin became prime minister in 1977, and a right-wing government for the first time in Israel's history was in power, and that really enabled the Jewish settlements to grow and be built more in this area. So at this time, my mom would tell me that she would visit Bethlehem, they would visit Jericho. It was really open for Israelis to go for various touristy things and just to visit. The Palestinians did need permits to come into Israel, but at the time, it was really Israelis freely went into these areas as well. In 1987, the Intifada began, the first Intifada began, and two things happened after that. One, Rabin, who was the prime minister, decided that it was a good time to initiate and seek out peace with the Palestinians. And Arafat was from the PA side. He was concerned that Hamas would rise in power and regain control of this area. And therefore, his solution to maintain in power was to discuss with Israel, or to talk to Israel, basically. So this is what leads us to the Oslo Accords, which we are now in the situation of the Oslo Accords until today. 1993 was the agreement of just mutual discussion. In 1995 was the first step, which I will show in the next map. Here, I'm just making sure. Okay. This is the next map of what the West Bank, Judea and Samaria looks like at the moment. And this was the agreement that was decided upon in 1995 as a first step to reaching a Palestinian autonomy, a Palestinian state. And this is where we are today as well. So the Area C is fully under Israeli jurisdiction. So that's the blue that we see in the background. Area A is full Palestinian control. It's divided into two. One is civilian control, which means they're in charge of education, medical, building roads, and so this in charge of civilian lives generally. Another is security. So in Area A, it's full Palestinian control. We're talking about mostly 7 main areas. You have Bethlehem, you have Jericho, you have Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus. Those are 7 main areas that are under Area A, and Israelis cannot go in. If they do, they have to sign waivers, and technically IDF cannot go into those areas. So if you've ever been to this area before, you'll see huge red signs letting you know that you're about to go into Area A, and it's your own, responsibility if you decide to do that. It's not under Israeli jurisdiction. Area B, however, is a middle ground. So Area B is comprised of mostly Palestinian towns and villages. And here in this case, the civilian responsibility is in the Palestinian Authority. However, security control is by Israel. So meaning the IDF can go into these villages and they're responsible for security in these areas. However, medical services, schools, education, roads are under the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. So it's this complete kind of jigsaw of all these different kind of things blending in together, and honestly a mess, if we're being completely honest. And this is a situation in 1995 that was created with the Oslo Accords. And what happened is that in 2000, Ehud Barak sat down with Yasser Arafat and offered 97% of the West Bank in order to create a Palestinian state. And the Palestinians said no. And in fact, that's also immediately afterwards began the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada is also known because that's when blowing up buses began as well. So it became much more violent in a personal manner, meaning it wasn't just rock throwing, with a bunch of people together and you had to stay away, but it could be that you were on a random bus and it would blow up all of a sudden, or in a coffee shop, for example. So the Second Intifada was way more violent. And for a lot of people, it was shocking because up until this point, there was an agreement, there was peace with Egypt, there was a discussion, there was also peace with Jordan that happened late 1980s as well. And so the fact that it led up until this point in 2000, it kind of broke. For a lot of people, it was a breaking point as well. And I'll also note that in 2000, they tried this idea again with Olmert. He had a very similar proposition as well. And again, the Palestinians said that they were not interested. Or they claimed that it wasn't enough for whatever reason, and that they do not agree to what Israel had offered them, basically. Okay, so that leads us basically up until today, where we have this. This is the Trump plan for peace. And as you can see, it really, the idea here is that certain settlements will be, certain settlement blocks and certain pieces of land are added to Israel and annexed to Israel. But in this case, you have this even more of a mess, piece of land that's connected West Bank Gaza tunnel is connected to Gaza. You have some areas here, you say residential and agriculture, industrial zone, and you have a lot of roads connecting here and ports. So this is the discussion that's being at the moment. And on one hand, I'll say that for people who are more on the right, and agree with Netanyahu and Trump that this plan is good, they say, we have been offering up until now various plans, and the Palestinians said no. We are going to begin finding a solution to this because this middle ground area, we don't want it to keep lasting for 53 years. On the other hand, I'll also know that I was on a call with Dennis Ross recently, and I've also been reading articles like other people. The Palestinians were not part of the conversation in this plan at all. It was just offered to them and told to them that it was going to happen. And in addition, this is not a continuous piece of land. So it really makes it difficult from the Palestinian side to think that this is their state, that these separated piece of land are all one and going to be a state. So that is a discussion from both sides. And I'll also say that on the right, there are claims that this plan is horrible because it even gives recognition to the Palestinian state, period, and we should be annexing everything and just not giving the Palestinians a right to vote. So that's, for a lot of more extreme right-wing people, that is a solution. Annex everything, a one-state solution, and not giving the Palestinians the right to vote in order to maintain that Jewish majority. So I will now mention the plan that was going to be starting to happen on July 1st. I know this is in Hebrew, but I will also refer to the previous map that it's in English. So what they're talking about right now is annexing the Jordan Valley and the northern part of the Dead Sea. So we have here Jericho, so just pay attention to that. And basically what they're talking about is annexing the northern part of the Dead Sea, and Jericho being in the middle over here. So Jericho is right over here, so that they cover pretty much that, and Jericho is like in the middle. So that's what they're talking about basically at the moment, and annexing that part of land in order to strengthen the Israeli border with Jordan, and to add about 30 different Jewish settlements to be part of Israel officially. At the same time, this makes Jordan mad. It makes the Palestinians not pleased as well with the situation that's going to happen. And I'll also know that this past Saturday night, there was a demonstration that happened in Tel Aviv, and these are the signs. So as you can see, the signs are cleverly used to make us think of the Black Lives Matter as well, which has been a main discussion in the States. So clearly the protest or the reference is to what is happening in the States and trying to compare between that. You can look at that and see it as you want, but clearly there is a reference to that regarding the new decision that's coming and also what's happening in the United States at the same time. Okay, so that's regarding the plan to peace. That's land related, and what has been happening up until now from the various different point of views. At the same time, I do want to add another point as well, and then I will refer to questions, and that will be the end of my lecture, basically. So my point is of trying to lead up until now is, yes, we can have a political discussion about what you think about annexation and what do you think about the situation with the Palestinians and etc. But my point is to show that it started in 1967 and has led us up until this point, and to really try to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What has happened with Sinai, what has happened with the Golan Heights, what has happened with Gaza, and what has happened in the West Bank. And not only look at just the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, but look at the entire picture that took place in 1967 and what has happened up until this point. And yes, the situation is complicated and it's very complex. And a lot of things need to be solved. But at the same time, it's important to understand that bigger picture and what has been done up until this point to really look at the situation of annexation in the broader context as well. So before I answer questions, and I'm happy to hear from you and comments as well, I do want to mention one point that's relevant to this road to peace. So I've mentioned, the different opinions regarding annexation and Jewish settlements. The people have opinions that those are the things that are really the problem for peace. That this plan is not a good solution in order to reach peace with the Palestinians. But I'll say from the other side as well that I recently listened to a podcast that was on the Tikva Fund, if people have heard of it. And the person who spoke was Einat Wilf, who's a Middle East expert, and she herself was a member of Knesset from the Labor Party. And the person who's hosting, his name is Jonathan Silver. He's the editor, and he also is a member of B'nai. So it's a personal moment to share something that our member has done or is part of as well. So here I put the link now if you would like to listen to it more afterwards. And Einat Wilf wrote a book about this subject, but I'm now going to refer to the issue of Palestinian refugees because as somebody who she believes in a two-state solution, she actually says that the roadblock to peace is the Palestinian refugees and that issue. And it's a subject that I think does not get mentioned often enough regarding the peace, the discussions. And I do want to briefly talk about that before we get into questions. So I know that the Palestinian refugees is an issue from 1948, but when there are discussions of peace plans, the idea of right of return of these Palestinian refugees is often in discussion. And I just want to understand what that means regarding a peace plan when that is being discussed. So, so after the 1948, the UN founded a temporary agency called UNRWA, which is United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And in their website, this is the definition for Palestine refugees, which is a different definition than regular refugees. So Palestine refugees are defined as persons whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period of the 1st of June, 1946 to 15th of May, 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. UNRWA services are available to all those living in its area of operations who meet this definition, who are registered with the agency and who need assistance. The descendants of Palestinian refugee males, including adopted children, are also eligible for registration. When the agency began operations in 1950, it was responding to the needs of about 750,000 Palestinian refugees. Today, some 5 million Palestinian refugees are eligible for UNRWA services. So Palestinian refugees are basically the only refugees in the world whose numbers grow year upon year upon year. They, as it says, they sign up descendants of Palestinian refugees, including adopted children, to be eligible to have that right of return to return to Palestine. So what does that mean? That the numbers are now grown to have 5.5 million Palestinians who, if and when a Palestinian country wants to be founded, they have the right to move to this Palestine. So why does that matter? So basically, the idea is that in almost any opportunity, people are given, in almost every situation, descendants are given are given the fact that they're Palestinian refugees. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to give a specific example. There are these two models known to name Bella and Gigi Hadid, and their father is a millionaire, Muhammad Hadid, who lives in LA, and he's a billionaire, and he is considered to be a Palestinian refugee. So it's just to understand how far the extent is regarding what a refugee is. It's not somebody who's displaced and needs a home today and needs that citizenship. It's somebody who just used to live in Palestine, and then they're able and eligible to be part of a Palestinian state whenever it is founded and have that right of return. So that means, and I'm going to quote Einat Wilf now, that she believes that this is the main roadblock to peace because the Palestinians are kind of showing in this case that they never saw that the war with Israel was over. And this is their way to ruin Israel with an Arab majority, and by that sense, eliminating the Jewish state. So having this Palestinian refugees kind of in their pocket allows this number to grow to millions and millions and millions, more and more as time goes on. So the more they wait, the more power they gain. And when a Palestinian state is founded, they'll be able to have all those people come over and claim citizenship and basically eliminate the Jewish majority that is in Israel. And in that case, eliminate Israel in its entirety. So I really recommend you to listen to her blog, to the podcast, because she explains it way better, and she is really a Middle East expert. But I thought that it was extremely interesting and important to be aware of as well, because she's somebody who believes in the two-state solution and wants peace with the Palestinians, and yet she's saying that this is an important issue to consider and find a solution for, or change the definition of Palestinian refugees in order to actually reach a solution where we're having two states side by side that can really coexist together. So I am not here to claim or decide what really is the road to peace and how to achieve that. But I do want to say, that I said beforehand, that taking a step back, looking at 1967, seeing what has happened with the different areas up until now, what is the history that has led us up until this point to July 1st regarding annexation, and understanding a couple subjects regarding that has happened from the 1967 war. I'm hoping that that can give us a little bit of thought regarding what is in fact the road to peace, how can it be achieved, what is the correct way, and to have our own thoughts be developed and expanded upon what we originally thought before this session. And again, there's so much more research to do, and I really recommend to always learn more and look more into it. But I hope that the historical explanation can kind of give that big picture. And that's basically what I wanted to show from today, that from a victorious war of achieving this land, we've now reached this complex situation, but looking at the bigger picture altogether. So now I will answer questions. So feel free to write in the chat. I see Taibo has raised her hand, and we have a lot of questions from Jonathan. So I'll take two from Jonathan. I'll read them out, and then we'll go back and forth in that case. Okay. So the first two questions are: how did Egypt convince King Hussein of Jordan to go to war with Israel on the third day of the 6-day war? Which generals designed the preemptive strike on Egypt? Okay. So I would read the book to be more specific, but from my understanding and from what I remember, it's important to understand that you have a united Arab front in all the Middle East. Israel is the one state that's a Jewish state. So Jordan, on one hand, wants to appease certain countries, but at the same time, they also want to maintain that connection with with Egypt and Syria. So when they put enough pressure, and they were verbal enough in saying also that they were winning the war, Egypt and Syria were claiming they were winning the war. Nobody knew for quite a long time that 75% of Egypt's air force was gone. So all of those things kind of said, okay, you have to join in the wagon and gain some from Israel as well. We have to annihilate this country. So that's pretty much how they got them on board. It's kind of deception, but also the United Arab Front and the deception of the fact that they were already winning the war, if we put it together. The people who designed it, Moshe Dayan was very much a part of it, and also Moti Hod, who was the IAF commander, Israeli Air Force commander at the time, are the two main people who were involved in it. But again, I would look more into it, and I'm happy to look more into it for you. This book goes really into depth, and I really recommend it if you're really interested. I'll let Taibo ask a question. I saw two people were raising their hand. So Taibo, you can ask your question, unmute yourself, and then we'll continue with the written questions.
First, I want to say before the question, I had to choose tonight between a great Tikva lecture and you, and I picked you, even though both will be recorded. I wanted you to know.
Thank you.
Okay. There was an American academic at Columbia. His name was Edward Said. And he claimed to be a, quote, Palestinian. He was not. He was born in Egypt. He did have cousins who lived in the grandfather's compound, whatever, and he claimed. But because of all sorts of, I can't even explain, but the point is, no one ever publicly said, yeah, you're related to people like this, but you really aren't. You should stop pretending, because it wasn't at the point where he was really going to say, I want my grandfather's house back, which would have been his cousins. But in all of this, is there ever any discussion of And I'm not talking about the uniqueness of being able to give even adopted children this particular category of being a refugee, but the fact that so many people fake it.
So if you listen to the podcast, and again, there's other opinions regarding the Palestinian refugees, she'll claim that they want to add as many people as possible. They even barely let people, they barely erase people when they pass away. So there is nothing that is preventing the UNRWA agency from adding people. And in fact, the fact that somebody's faking it is probably really helping the Palestinian idea regarding the refugees. So it's really supporting this idea that Inat Wilt is talking about, and I'm representing what she's saying. Again, if you spoke to a Palestinian, they would represent it completely differently. So I just want to be upfront about that. So the fact that someone's taking it was actually helping and completely makes sense. Okay, so I'm gonna, here I'll refer to two more questions, and then I saw that Stephen also was raising his hand, so I'll refer to you afterwards. Okay. So there's two questions, and the second one I think is also very important. How did they get Prime Minister Levi Eshkol on board? So this is for the 6-day war. How did Levi Eshkol agree to the war, basically? And then also, why technically is it annexation on the settlements in Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley if Israel already took this territory in the 6-day war? Okay. So first, basically what happened is that Levi Eshkol took all the diplomatic routes that he could. He spoke to the US, he spoke to the Soviets. It was a long discussion over a course of a month, sending Abba Evan to speak to them, and it wasn't achieving results. So at that point, when you're seeing Egyptian forces towards the border, you're hearing their violent proclamations, and you having somebody who's as, Moshe Dayan, he was very, pushy and demanding in his way. So having all of those things together kind of pushed him towards the idea that there was a majority who wanted to go to war. So he agreed to that in the end as well. The second question about annexation is the fact that even though you conquer a piece of land, there is this kind of middle ground before you actually annex the country. And what annexing means is that you're giving full rights to the people who are in this place, in this piece of land, and they have full citizenship, they have full rights, they can vote, they have also social security rights as well, alongside the fact that they have to pay taxes to Israel. And all those things don't apply to people who are Palestinians in the West Bank. There's military jurisdiction. So for example, all the courts that are in the West Bank are military courts, and they function a different way. So even though they conquered this piece of land and it is under Israeli jurisdiction, it's not completely under the Israeli government authority. So it's not something that we're so familiar with today because Israel is a relatively young country, whereas a lot of countries dealt with these issues a long time ago. But it's important to be aware of that middle ground that Israel had not really kind of defined. Okay, so Stephen, I see you're raising your hand, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hey, Steve Goldberg. Yes, I'd like you to define how they determine settlement blocks. And there's apparently a number 121 as the number of settlement blocks. And are these the ones that are being annexed in this current agreement?
So at the moment, what's happening in July 1st, that's why I showed it two parts, or I'll show it the map again. What they're annexing right now is just the Jordan Valley and the northern of the Dead Sea. So we're talking about, this is the plan, right? But what we're talking about is just where is it? Is just from the northern part of the Dead Sea, including Jericho, up here. So that's all we're talking about. All the other settlement blocks that we have in between are not happening yet. The settlement blocks, like just for example, I'm from southern Jerusalem. So, and you see where Bethlehem is. So if you see the dot where my dad is, I think he's still here. So where he physically is right now, he's about somewhere here. So the Gush Etzion block is somewhere, I guess, near here or here. And Bethlehem, again, is part of the Palestinian territories, but this is not happening right now. It's part of the plan. The settlement blocks will be part of Israel, and you can see that it's, you know, interspersed in between. But the July 7th that we're talking about, July 1st discussion that we're talking about right now is just the Jordan Valley and the northern part near the Dead Sea, and the settlements that are there. So you have 30 settlements in this list that are in Hebrew, and those are the different numbers that are dispersed here, if that makes sense. So I hope that explains it. So again, it could be something that's discussed and changed, but that's what we're talking about regarding July at the moment. Okay. So now I think there's more questions from Jonathan. You're asking great questions, so it's great. Okay, so, and then I saw that John asked a question too, so I'll refer to that afterwards. So which parties actually started the groundwork for Sadat's coming to the Knesset in Jerusalem and laying the groundwork for the Camp David Accord peace treaty? So 1977 was when Begin was voted in. And I'm trying to remember who was beforehand. It was Rabin, okay. So it was Rabin who laid down that groundwork. But the person who actually followed through with it was Begin in the end. He visited, you know, Israel in 1977. The actual exchange of land happened in 79, 80, and the final stages were 82. Okay. So there's here. Okay. I'm going to read two more questions, and because some of them I don't feel that I can answer. So so you're saying that why are still Jews able to go up to the Temple Mount like you did in 1979? And if you could explain your last question about you said about will the prospective annexation really negate the Oslo Accord?
Yeah.
So if you could explain that, I'll just talk about the first thing.
Well, the point is that.
Okay, so explain, then I'll answer both questions.
I mean, 67, they took the entire Judea and Samaria, the entire West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, technically, and obviously, biblically, there's the argument that it was always part of Israel, Greater Israel. I mean, we can sit there and debate that till doomsday. That's not what I'm talking about. But yeah,
mm-hmm.
But essentially, the Oslo Accords basically started to delineate sections giving actual powers to the Palestinians to control certain sections within Judea and Samaria. So it was it was giving lands sort of back in a way officially to the Palestinians in certain areas in Judea and Samaria. But technically speaking, it was really all Israel's to begin with. So there's the issue of what you can't really give back what you already have, so to speak, I guess is the argument. Yeah, I mean, and then the premise is, well, if you're going to annex it, does that negate what the point of what Oslo was, to actually move these territories toward exactly where they are, towards as a first point toward giving autonomy toward a state for the Palestinians.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it. So again, this is, I didn't say this beforehand, but I hope that it's obvious that I'm talking as Netta. I'm not representing either the Jewish Agency or B'nai. So also please do more research after this. And also, as much as I tried to stay neutral and express both sides, I'm sure my political opinion came out a little bit. So I just wanted to keep that up front as well. So regarding the Temple Mount, first of all, despite the fact that it is under the Waqf, it's under Jordanian jurisdiction, there are certain times that Jews can go up. And when people do go up, you know, it causes often tension and problems when people do it, you know, and they're singing, you know, Jewish songs, or, you know, they're dancing around, they're clearly praying. It's become, you know, a demonstration to cause that tension by praying on the Temple Mount, because there's a whole movement of Jews who really think that Jews should have right all the time to go on the Temple Mount, not only in certain times. So you were definitely able to go to, people can still go today, maybe not right now because of Corona, but generally people can. But it's very limited to what you can do when you get on the Temple Mount. Regarding the second question of if in fact annexation is going against what the Oslo Accords were about, then the answer is pretty much yes. And that's what also, you know, Dennis Ross would tell you if you look at the Trump peace plan. And also a lot of people from various political sides would say that as well. But at the same time, on the other hand, you know, if you're looking a step back, people on the other side would say the Oslo Accords did not work. You know, we tried that. We all offered in 2000, we offered in 2008, and clearly that's not what they want. They don't want a Palestinian state. They probably want the annihilation of Israel in that case. So how are we going to find a solution that puts all the pieces together, that doesn't maintain this middle ground situation today? At the same time, is this peace? Is this the road to peace in that case if we're annexing and kind of letting Oslo die? So those are the questions now that we're dealing with, but it's important to have that full picture, again, like I was saying beforehand, because it gives you ideas where both perspectives come from. That Oslo was really important, we want to maintain that and let it live, and also the other people are saying it died already and we should find a solution. Okay.
I'll be real quick. What really, even more than that, what got us is when we came into the to the Kotel area, and my wife was carrying my Talis bag with a bunch of kippot and stuff. It was fairly large, and they basically harassed her. The local police there pushed her to the side, made an embarrassment out of her, and said she couldn't come through because obviously she had paraphernalia in there, accoutrement to making a demonstration on the female side of the Kotel, and that was not legal, and you couldn't do that. And we actually had a special attorney with us from the Reform movement, and spoke to them, and they let us through, and we did a little prayer in the back, and they wrote it up in the paper. It was a precursor to the whole movement, Rabbi Jacobs doing his thing later. But
interesting.
But yeah, it was a big to do, and you know, I was like, she's just carrying a bunch of kippot in my Talis bag because we came from services, and we went to. So
this is on the Temple Mount itself.
Well, you got to go to the Kotel. No, it isn't the Temple Mount. It's the Kotel.
Oh, it's the Kotel. Okay.
I mean, my incident when I went to the Kotel. I mean, to the Temple Mount, I haven't gone to 79. I mean, that was
okay, I understand. So I see Maurice is raising her hand, but I'm also going to refer to John's questions first, and then I'll let you speak. I'm happy that there's so many questions. This is the purpose of this, and I'm happy that I did this in that case. Okay, so John asked, how or why did Israel take control of the West Bank if they were having trouble with Egypt originally? That's a really good question. And also I'll say that the 5th day is also when they decided they have to go into Syria. They can't just, take advantage, they can't just not go into Syria. So the Golan Heights was an afterthought during the war. Nobody at all thought that Golan Heights would be part of Israel like it is today. The West Bank specifically what happened is that when Israel, the IDF specifically, were able to go into Sinai super quick. The forces were not ready, as if you mentioned, I remember I said beforehand, the Egypt forces were a lot in Yemen and they were not prepared. They didn't have any military preparation beforehand. So Israel managed to go all of Sinai super, super quickly. So they had other battalions in different places and they said, just go, we have the upper hand. We're doing so well. Let's take advantage of, first of all, reaching Jerusalem, and then reaching other locations that were important to the Jewish people. Because if you think about it, the places that are mentioned in the Bible are mostly in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria. So Hebron, Nablus, all these places have important locations to Jewish history. And that was the idea behind it, of having the upper hand, taking advantage of it. In Syria, because they were sending rockets, and that's also what started the whole 1967 whole story of events, they took advantage of that as well right towards the end of the war. So it's a good question to understand why it actually happened. It was because that the war started with such an upper hand of Israel, and they, were like, let's go, let's do this thing, And just 6 days, they had this 3.5 times of a country that they had beforehand. Maurice, I'm going to unmute you and feel free to ask a question. Oh, wait, here, so sorry, you can't hear you. Wait, I think you have to unmute yourself.
The Second Intifada undermined the Oslo Accords because I know family members who were very much for the Oslo Accords who just went over to the other side during the Second Intifada. And at the moment, I don't really see any solution. Let me put it this way. The first time I was in Israel was early 80s. I was able to go up to the Temple Mount. I was inside the Dome of the Rock, etc., etc., etc. And there weren't the problems. I came as a visiting scientist in '86 to Machon Weizmann, okay? And in December, I think it was either '86 or '87, the first Intifada broke out.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, there was a lot of, by the way, I missed 90% of your presentation because somehow I couldn't get sound. I don't really see solutions. I don't know whether annexation is a good thing or not. Let me put it this way. If Palestinians can live in Israel, why can't Jews live in Palestine and have rights in Palestine and practice religion or whatever?
Because the Jews would prefer living in Israel, and I think that the final thing is and it's a difficult situation with how to create a situation that is agreeable for both. I think there are no more questions, and I see that also people are starting to leave, which is okay because it's 8:38 already. I'm going to ask one more time if there are any questions, and feel free to either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Okay. And now I will just conclude and say that we can talk about this subject for a really long time. I think when people think of Israel, the first thing they think of is the conflict and, what are you going to do with the Palestinians? And what's going to happen and what is the result and who did you vote for and why did you vote for them? They're not going to achieve peace, or they are going to achieve peace. And that's the first thing that people think of regarding Israel, to be completely honest. And the idea of this session was really to just take a step back and let's look at the 6-Day War. Let's see what has happened up until now. We can also discuss and debate regarding, what is the solution and if there's a solution and what is the best one. But looking at the big picture and taking a step back, I think is super important to understand the different sides that we're still talking about today. And I think it's pretty incredible that 53 years later, this war has become so significant. Not in the fact that it was short term, which was so victorious, but creating such a complex situation that we don't really know what is the best way to solve, like Maurice said. So I hope that I gave you a little bit of food for thought, and I appreciate the comment that was already left here saying that it was very informative. I appreciate that. If anybody wants the recording, it will be on YouTube, and I'm happy to send it for you or for anyone else. And I wish you all a good night. And I hope that this will be, I wish good times for everyone in the US and Israel and for peace, basically. Okay. I don't know if somebody was trying to say something, but thank you so much, and Laila Tov to everyone.
Thank you, Netta.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.